Hi, I'm Rigger. This is Your Rant. Today we're talking death and hell and theories. Fun times. First up, YouTube things. If you like it, like it. Share it if you think others would like it. Let me know what you think in the comments below and subscribe for more. Before we start, that's a big old spoiler warning for Volume 8, Chapter 5. That's your warning. Now let's get into it. So, Mantle's new waterfront properties aren't really looking that desirable, are they? But yeah, as you may have guessed, we're here to talk about the River Styx. Anyone who likes their literature, be it modern or classic, should recognize that name. It's very common in anything based around mythology, be it Dante's Inferno or Percy Jackson. You've probably heard about people crossing the River of the Dead to the underworld in some fashion. Usually there's a ferryman to take you across. It's been different people, though usually it's Charon or Chiron or Cheiron or Hadron or however you want to pronounce it. I admit my ancient Greek isn't what it used to be, and a lot of the time he's depicted as looking like a classic Grim Reaper sword, or sometimes a very withered old man. Something to that adjacent. Big cloak, maybe a skeleton, maybe both, maybe just a dude, usually silent. You pay the fee and he takes you across. It's that simple. Is it coins left on the eyes of the dead? Is it a coin put in the mouth of the dead? It's whatever else. Depends what you're reading, history or fantasy. Also, yeah, the river itself has a lot to talk about. There's a lot of history there. It's usually depicted as basically a barrier to the real underworld. You have to cross it to find your final resting place in the afterlife, be it good or bad. If you can't pay, you're stuck on the riverbank, and if you decide to try and touch it and swim, well, don't. Yeah, just don't. Also, when you are crossing it, watch out for those, trying to pull you into it who made that mistake, because that's a real thing. Fair warning. But also, if you want to dive into the more actual history, there was Styx the goddess, who was the goddess of the river, and there's a whole history there, and there's a lot to get through. Though in that version, the river usually made you very powerful. In fact, here's where all the Ruby lovers' ears perk up. It's the river that Achilles was dipped in to make him so powerful. The only bit that wasn't dipped in was his heel, because that's where he was being held. Yeah, so that's a thing. So I guess all of you Piran nuts get on those theories that she's going to claw her way out of the river all grimified. Don't get me wrong, it's not gonna happen, but legitimately if you wanted it to happen, this is probably the best chance you've ever had in the show so far. It actually has direct references to Achilles here. And then you could call Salem the goddess of the river, since she fell into it and became it. Sort of a blending of the different myths and stories. Go nuts, guys. Pyrrha's totally coming back this time. But that aside, as you may have guessed, ancient scripture about religion, often passed by word of mouth and then translated across multiple languages, then adapted by pop culture in many ways with liberties taken, isn't the most conclusive, solid thing to work with. And I may have a lot of love for ancient history, especially in my youth, but I'm no expert. However, we have an ace up our sleeves here in that the writers of Ruby are also, as far as I know, not experts. And I have a feeling that the people at the RT offices weren't ringing up ancient historians to get their input on this sort of side idea for part of one volume. Meaning, if we're going to see reference to it, there's a good chance they'll be as informed as I am, which means they've jumped on Google, scrolled through Wikipedia, and seen reference to it in pop culture. Not to mention lots of Ruby is informed by pop culture anyway, and the references, especially video game references, are pretty strong throughout the show. So if we're talking Greek history, things like God of War come to mind, right? And guess what? In one of the God of Wars, you do travel the River Styx. So yeah, you're more likely to get a reference to that than you are to the real history of it, if you're doing it in the context of Ruby. Now, one thing I will mention is that this is a piece of religion. It does have legitimate religious background. So without getting too deep on the real issue, Rooster Teeth has had some bad scrapes with discussions about religious-inspired work in their story. However, two things are very important here. One, I don't think they'll call it the River Styx or anything. I don't think they'll be that direct about it, especially these days after what happened. So it'll be more like, if you know the River Styx or those sort of ideas, you'll get it, but they're not going to explicitly call it that. And also, it's just that this was written long before that latest controversy. This was written ages ago, well before that Grim contest even started. So this was already happening, and it was probably too late to change it because it's probably melded into quite a few episodes and the storyline. Which means that there's a good chance that if this is a reference to River Styx, and I have a feeling it kind of might be, at least informed by that, they're just not going to say it in a live stream or whatever. They're not going to use that phrase, and they're just going to hope no one noticed. Sorry guys, maybe I noticed. But from that, let's extrapolate that if this is an embodiment or reference to the River Styx, it's probably an adaptation of pop culture's knowledge of the thing, and then filter it through some metaphor and change it for fun and then fit it into Ruby. Ruby does this all the time. So what do I mean by this? Well, rather than say it's this exactly to the myth, let's instead treat it as something inspired by the idea of the River Styx as it's known today. Because I don't think it'll be very blatant, I don't think it'll be overly referenced, and I don't expect a hooded skeleton in a rowboat to appear and stick out his hand for some lien to provide passage across. But that aside, let's look at what it could mean and what we could potentially look out for. First up, don't cross it. Yeah, this is the really big one, and the reason I made this video is I have a really bad feeling for anyone who in the course of the story decides to cross over that ravine. It may be that someone needs rescuing on the other side and they simply have to find a way to cross, grab them, and cross back. But this may seal their death. And in a lot of interpretations, you can't cross back over the river Styx. As mentioned, you can't touch it, and yeah, I don't think touching this one's a good idea either. And while physically the characters may be able to cross over it and back again in the show, I do wonder if once a character crosses over the top of it, even if they come back, metaphorically they never really do. After crossing it, you're fated to die. You never really come back. Once it's crossed, it's never really crossed back over again, and even in the real world if that's what happens. Unless they cross it and die in the show, like the ravine widens separating them away and they're put into a fight on the other side, which ends up costing them their life. Certainly, that's not impossible. I can see it potentially, though it doesn't really seem to fit with how the storytelling is usually told. However, I do think the other idea of someone making the mistake of crossing the river, and that person will then be marked for death later in the volume, could be very legitimate. Given Ren's death flags, it may be something like launching off Jean's shield to cross it, or maybe his grappling hooks, and I'd be worried if that happens. Since they're the ground team that's literally right next to it, if Ren for any reason finds a reason to go over this river and cross it, even if he does cross back in the show, I'd be very worried for his survival. I'm very serious. Usually in the stories and myths, you need magic items or divine intervention to somehow cross back again or get out. Sometimes there are secret passages out, but my overall point is without getting really specific references in there, I don't have high hopes for anyone that crosses this river. And to put a little cherry on top, in Dante's Inferno, it was the river to cross to the 5th circle of hell, which is where the wrathful and sullen are punished. Sullen means bad-tempered or sulking. Gods, it's really not looking great for Ren right now, is it? And if you don't believe that, then at least someone crossing it will get a very bad injury or consequence because everyone pays a toll to cross the river. Now, I admit, that's the really big theory here, that no one should cross it or definitely not touch it. That's the reason I made this video and what you should take away from it. But for while we're here and we're talking about it, let's have some discussion about other stuff to do with it. First up, I'm aware of the theory it's going to flood into the crater. It makes sense, it works like liquid, and that's a horrible idea. Also, if Salem wanted to basically create a new permanent grim pool in the crater, that's a lovely big candidate there. In fact, that sounds more likely to me. I don't think the aim is to murder everyone in the slums, that's just the side effect. She has no need to do that, her only target is really the relic. The humans in the area are as ants to her, no need to squash them, but if they do get squashed, who cares? A new sort of base at the top of the world, making a new grim pool in that crater, I mean she could basically conquer this whole continent. There's no one else to stop her, so this just becomes Salem Land number 2, and it's a good port into Mistral and other countries just across the water there, through ports like Argus, which means John's sister needs to run. Also, next theory while we're talking about it, there is the one that I've mentioned a couple times, that it will spawn the wave of Sulphurfish, the Grim contest winner. Because despite them not pouring out of the crack like I initially said, simply putting Grim winner spawns from the river because the river will spawn a boss is just as likely, so it simply moves it later in the episodes, but it's still the same functionally. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Now, as for something that'd be cool to see, it's not really a reference to anything, but if the Grim River did need to be crossed, or you could run up it to the whale where it's presumably spawning from, then Ruby freezing it with her silver eyes could be really cool. I imagine like a frozen waterfall, it all becomes stone or stone-coated, petrified, but it doesn't take long to break up and start flowing again, so there's the time limit based thing. If she could freeze it up to the whale and do a Weist-assisted glyph run up the stone waterfall up to the whale for a Salem confrontation or something, that could be really cool. Same applies for Harriet, it just seems unlikely with her character right now, but I think it'd have to be someone very mobile. It feels like something you'd have to quickly do, not everyone could do it. But to finish it off, I have one last big idea for the river, back to our more deathy theories. One last idea that is relevant to the River Styx is lost souls in the river, but perhaps they're more like echoes calling out to people to entice them to come closer or even touch it. It could be much more likely where you get something like your Pyrrha appearance here, or Summer, or even Roman if it's Neo. Or all of them, if it's a mass effect that happens to a lot of the people. Ren seeing his parents, maybe Nora seeing her parents even. If Ren dies and Nora sees Ren in it, Crow seeing Summer is also another one. In fact, that can be a good way to tell that this is a false thing that's happening. If Ruby sees Summer one way, and then you cut to Crow's perspective and he's seeing Summer another way. And since Crow is so grief-stricken already, what it says to him or what he says back to it could be a good way to get some insight on what happened with that relationship there, if they want to do it in a little fun sort of half-reveal and tease it. Because of course, the Summer would be saying things like either that she blames him and he says, "I'm sorry, forgive me," or she says that she forgives him and he crawls up and we can all interpret what we think that might mean. You know, there's lots of possibilities there. The fandom's talked about it forever. But you could get a little insight into that, you know, sort of relationship without actually explaining what happened yet. This kind of scenario I find much more likely because it's a magical effect. It's not real. It's a horrible, nasty trick to lure you to the river, to touch it or be close enough to attack from it. That's much more in line with mythology, where you have things like sirens, etc., and nasty tricks are a staple of a lot of stories involving hells or the underworld. If our characters see their long-lost loved ones and are enticed towards the river, this could also be another apathy moment where her silver eyes go off, freezing the river over briefly, so Ruby can save everyone and drag them away from it, possibly using her group semblance to sweep them up and collect them away. But yeah, I'll be honest, I wrote this idea for this video down like last night, and in my notes under stuff to talk about, I also wrote down Maria. I don't have an exact recollection of exactly what that was about. Maybe, if I was to guess, it's just that I expect her to die at some point, but my best guess is actually that I was making connection with the Grim Reaper, her old title, and all of her Day of the Dead inspirations, that if someone were going to have an interaction with the representation of the afterlife, it may as well be her. It's simply all the influences line up, despite being cross-cultural. Just like the Day of the Dead, the underworld isn't really hell the way we think of it now, where all the bad souls go. It's just where all souls go. It's good and bad. There are different areas of it once you're there. But given the show and the origin of this grim pool and the in-universe explanation, I think it's safer to lean on the darker interpretations of these things for this narrative. But that about comes to the end of it, alright? A bit of a weak ending, but it's simply an off-the-cuff kind of theory that I started writing and it just kind of kept working, and now we're here. So I'd love to know your thoughts on the subject, everyone. If you have expanded thoughts, please put them down, because this was a pretty quick one. So that means that we're done here for today. Like the video if you like it, share if you think others would like it, let me know your thoughts and theories down below, because I'll be reading them in the comments, and subscribe for more. Until next time, always remember to wait 30 minutes after reading before you swim in the River of Lost Souls, and never forget to tip your ferryman. My name is Rigger, hope you have a wonderful day, and hope I did alright.